Ladies and gentlemen, Roxanne.
Thank you, Nikki. And thanks to all of you for coming out to learn more about groundwater. We have 3 extremely knowledgeable speakers this evening, and I'm grateful that they're willing to share their time with us. I will introduce each of them now, and then they'll begin their presentations. After all 3 have spoken, we'll have time for questions from the audience. Write down your question and who it is for. Hold up your hand if you need a 3x5 card or have a question to submit. League members will hand out cards and collect questions. You can do this at any time during the presentations. Our first speaker will be Natalie Ballew. Ms. Ballew is the Groundwater Division Director at the Texas Water Development Board. After earning her master's degree in Energy and Earth Resources and Public Affairs at UT Austin, she headed straight for the TWDB. She previously managed their groundwater technical assistance team and also worked as a hydrogeologist on both the groundwater technical assistance and groundwater modeling teams. This year, she celebrates 10 years of service in the Groundwater Division at the Texas Water Development Board. The second presenter will be Larry Hall. Mr. Hall is the president of the 7-member Board of Directors for the Comal Trinity Groundwater Conservation District. He has held this position since the district was formed 10 years ago. He has a long 77-year history with Comal County, having been raised on the family farm and ranch along the Guadalupe River. Mr. Hall is a 1968 graduate of Texas A&M University. He is a military veteran and served with the United States Army in Vietnam. The final presenter is Roland Ruiz. Mr. Ruiz serves as General Manager of the Edwards Aquifer Authority, the EAA, a special purpose regional groundwater agency that is responsible for the management of one of the world's most prolific artesian aquifers. In his role as Chief Executive, he reports to a 17-member board of directors that oversees the EAA mission to manage, enhance, and protect the Edwards Aquifer system across 8 counties in south central Texas. Since assuming the general manager position in 2012, he has focused his leadership on creating shared value around the effective management of the Edwards Aquifer in the face of environmental, economic, and regulatory demands that are often exacerbated by drought, population growth, and competing interests around these issues. He has undertaken an effort to transform the EAA culture into a dynamic, service-minded operation that fosters greater collaboration, transparency, and responsiveness through values-centered critical thinking and stakeholder engagement. He has a broad and varied background in public affairs and community service in both the private and public sectors, including 21 years as an elected official serving on the Board of Trustees of a local school district. So I'd like to start with inviting Natalie to the podium.
For y'all to hear me? Yeah? Okay, cool. Hello everyone, nice to see such a packed room, even though it's a little toasty in here. If you start seeing sweat drip down my face, we're in the same boat. So, I was invited here to talk about kind of groundwater management and planning in Texas as a whole. And so I'm going to talk a little bit less about geology and drought specifics and more just about kind of how it all works in Texas. So first, I'm the Water Development Board, or part of the Water Development Board, and we are composed of 3 main kind of offices. We have a data and science office that collects water resources data all across the state of Texas. That kind of science and analysis then informs our state water planning process. And then ultimately, everything gets packaged up and we're essentially a bank that does cool science. So our agency funds wastewater, water infrastructure projects all across the state. And I'm not going to talk about this in my presentation, but I did want to mention it, is that we will have an item on the ballot in November relevant to our agency, and that is a $1 million constitutional amendment to basically take use and sales tax and put it into our water infrastructure, basically invest in our water future. And it's very similar to how TxDOT has a consistent revenue stream to keep all of our roads up to date. So just keep an eye out for that on the ballot and vote with your conscience. So I just got two things here that I'm going to talk about, just how groundwater planning works, and then also a little bit about who does what, because groundwater management is kind of scattered in many ways, and of course you'll hear from more actual groundwater managers about what they do, but I'll keep it very high level. Now, in the world that I work in, there are a lot of acronyms, and they all have the same three letters, mostly G, A, and M. And so I don't know if these get shared with folks afterwards, but if it's a good resource, it'll give you a little key to all the different acronyms we use. So I'll try not to use these acronyms, but if I do, someone yell at me and I'll spell out what it is. I won't read these all to you though. All right. Well, in Texas, groundwater management, the preferred method that the legislature has made a policy decision on is that it is local control. And so there are about 100 groundwater districts throughout the state. There are only actually 98 specific types of groundwater districts. For example, Larry here is the president of what we call a Chapter 36 water district. That's part of the Texas Water Code, whereas the Edwards Aquifer Authority is its own kind of special district. And so the Edwards Aquifer Authority and their two subsidence groundwater districts down the coast, those are slightly different than the rest of the groundwater districts in the state. And so this map here that you're looking at, any area that is colorful, that has a groundwater conservation district. Any space that is just a white box with a gray line, there's no groundwater regulation going on in that area of the state. And so all of these districts, they have their own management plans, their own rules to effectively manage the groundwater in their area. And then, of course, aquifers aren't limited to county lines. They're very broad. Multiple people across jurisdictions use that groundwater. And so the state legislature set up the system of groundwater management areas, which are essentially groups of groundwater conservation districts. And these are the groups that essentially plan for the future groundwater supplies within that area for their shared resource. And these areas are mostly delineated by our major aquifer boundaries. So all the kind of squiggly blobs that you see up there, those are our major aquifers. And for the most part, the groundwater management area boundaries mostly follow those major aquifers because those are the shared resources. But then, some of them follow county lines. As we delineated these, it's the Water Development Board's responsibility to delineate these areas. We got some stakeholder input about what the areas should be, and we have adjusted them a little bit over time, and we usually will do that on request of a groundwater district. Okay, so those are essentially the groups that are involved in the groundwater management or groundwater planning. So again, you have these groundwater management areas. They are groups of groundwater districts. They all have to come to consensus on what they want their aquifers to look like in the future. And here in Comal County, there are two major aquifers. You have the Trinity Aquifer, which is the green on the map here, and then you have the Edwards Balcones Fault Zone Aquifer, which is the blue. And the hatched marks areas are where the aquifer goes a little bit deeper into the ground, and the solid line areas are where it's more exposed at the surface, also known as recharge areas where precipitation can infiltrate into the aquifer. And so that puts Comal County into two different groundwater management areas. The dotted line that you see on here, that is the line that separates Groundwater Management Area 9 from Groundwater Management Area 10. But you have two different districts who are managing water resources in Comal County. You have the Comal County Groundwater Conservation District, Comal Trinity Groundwater District, and the Edwards Aquifer Authority, who's managing the Edwards Balcones Fault Zone. So what is joint planning? I've used that word a lot. Per statute, groundwater districts within a groundwater management area are required to meet at least annually to talk about various things that are laid out in the law. That includes just reviewing accomplishments of each district within the groundwater management area. It includes proposing a desired future conditions, which I'll talk about here in a minute. And they have to do that every 5 years. Essentially, the groundwater planning process is a 5-year cycle, very similar to our regional water planning process that's more expanded than just groundwater. And then districts are also required to pull all their management plans together, kind of look at how they're similar or different. And this is actually a new requirement after this legislative session. They have to kind of talk a little bit more in detail about what their management plans entail, what the impact of each district's goals are on the resource itself, and the effectiveness of all the measures that they have in place to conserve groundwater. And they also have to talk about how they are actually achieving their desired future conditions. So what are desired future conditions? These are a broad policy goal. It's what you want your aquifer to look like at some point in the future, 50 years into the future, so it aligns with our regional water planning process. And it has to be a quantitative description of what that aquifer is, and I'll show some examples here in a minute. Again, these are updated every single 5 years, so depending on the policy decisions that are made within a groundwater management area, the desired future conditions could change, ultimately impacting groundwater availability. And they can be, expressed in whatever way makes sense for the groundwater district to actually monitor how they are achieving their goals. So they can be established for a whole aquifer, each individual aquifer formation that makes up a bigger aquifer, different geologic strata, whatever makes sense. And then the kind of quantification side of things, it could be water level, like how much drawdown in a well there is. It could be spring flow. It could be storage volume. Again, it all is dependent on what kind of science a groundwater district has to support tracking their achievement of their policy goals. So I haven't talked about the modeled available groundwater yet, the MAGs, but just to kind of show you what this might look like. Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Super helpful. So examples of what a desired future condition is are on the left side of the screen here. And I like to think about aquifer systems as a bank account. All the water that sits in the aquifer, that's your total bank account. Anything that leaves the aquifer, that's like your spending. Anything that comes in, that's like your income. In a perfectly balanced world, they're equal and you have the same amount going in that you do going out. And so just some examples of what we see for desired future conditions across the state. You have no more than 30 feet of drawdown across a specific area, and that's like maintaining a certain amount of money in your savings account or in your bank account. You can maintain some percentage of the total volume an aquifer can hold, and that's like keeping that in your savings account. You could say, oh, I just want to maintain a certain amount of spring flow, and that's like, I just want to like keep this money aside so that I can pay for these annual bills that I have. And then essentially that gets translated into what would be required to achieve that goal that you have. And so modeled available groundwater would be like, okay, so you can pump 50,000 acre feet per year so that you can achieve your no more than 30 feet of drawdown. And that's essentially like putting in a goal saying like, I'm not gonna spend any more than this much so that I can keep what I want in my bank account. And so this is kind of a flow chart. We're going to start at the top with GCBs and advisors. This joint groundwater planning process, it informs both district management efforts and then also the state water planning process. And so groundwater conservation districts and any advisory groups that they set up are within that groundwater management area, and they're the ones who set the desired future conditions. That is a policy decision. That's that green arrow pointing at the policy. And then at the Water Development Board, we use our groundwater availability models, essentially an aquifer and a computer, to determine, it's all based on science, then we use those to determine what the groundwater availability is, and that is modeled available groundwater. And then once that groundwater availability is determined, It gets sent off to the groundwater conservation districts to develop their groundwater management plans as well as their rules to implement their plans. And it also gets shipped off to the regional water planning groups. And then on the regional water planning side, if you're not familiar with the regional water planning process, it's essentially a bottoms-up approach to planning. So the regional water planning groups are, more regional areas, and they get wrapped up into the state water plan. So that's more of the planning side of things. And then on the groundwater management side, you have the management plan and the rules. And then throughout that 5-year cycle, a groundwater district is monitoring and tracking their desired future conditions. And then you just kind of go around the circle every 5 years. And I will say that this process is sometimes tricky for groundwater conservation districts because the desired future conditions are a policy goal, but at the same time, state law requires that districts manage their groundwater to achieve their desired future conditions. So it becomes kind of a regulatory role, but also a planning role, and sometimes those are difficult to make match. All right, so who does what here? I'm of course going to talk about groundwater conservation districts. All of their roles and responsibilities are outlined in Chapter 36 of the Texas Water Code in Subchapter D. And so I'll just give you a minute. You can come up and look and read it if you want. Just kidding. Their fundamental mandate is to balance the protection of private property rights, and then balance that with conservation and also the development of groundwater. And all using the best available science that a district has, the state has, just whatever the best is that's out there. And these are kind of conflicting things to balance, and often some get weighed more than the others. And so that's why our preferred method is local management, so that the local folks can determine which of these need to be balanced more than others. And then, of course, you have Comal Trinity Groundwater Conservation District. They have a groundwater management plan. The Water Development Board has a role in reviewing and approving groundwater management plans from districts. We do not have to review and approve the Edwards Aquifer Authority's management plans because they're a different type of district. So I don't know if Larry will talk about any of this, but I'm sure that he'll talk about how they manage groundwater in their district. And this is a report from the Hill Country Alliance that I think is really handy if you haven't seen it yet. It's called Tools for Managing Groundwater in the Texas Hill Country. And the following slides basically pull information from it, but I think it's a really great tool because it lays out kind of everything that a groundwater district does, what tools are in the city and county toolboxes, and just essentially how you can get involved with things. But I'll give you the Cliff Notes version right now. So groundwater districts, they are essentially enabled to manage groundwater through their spacing and production limits. So, most of them have spacing requirements, so you can't put wells too close to each other. And then also, of course, you have pumping limitations as options for tools to use. They can require water use reports so they actually know how much water is coming out of their area. They are enabled to develop drought contingency plans, create management zones to reflect local conditions. That requires a lot of science. And they can, curtail pumping at any point if it's part of their drought contingency plan or if they notice that they're, not quite meeting their desired future condition. And then, of course, they are enabled to develop science to inform their decision making and engage in education and outreach. And then counties and cities actually have quite a lot of tools to kind of play a role in our groundwater management. On the left side here are the county tools, and on the right side are city tools. And so I'll just pick off a couple of these. On the county side, they can invest in land protection to promote recharge. That is something that I feel like we're seeing a little bit more of an emphasis on across the state. Essentially conservation easements, so that you can just conserve some land and not, put concrete all over it. On the city side, one that I really like on this list is encouraging rainwater harvesting and other alternative water sources because, Texas is just growing immensely. And it's honestly not looking that great for our water supply unless we do some really creative things. And so I really like I really like the rainwater harvesting and getting that a little bit more broad out there. And how you can get involved, you can get to know your groundwater district. You can engage with your elected officials. I believe that, are your districts elected? Appointed. But they're appointed by elected official. So engage with your elected officials, support scientific development. I think that is one of the things that is always overlooked in the groundwater world, because we can't see the water that we're, studying and managing. So often I think that the scientific investment gets overlooked. Of course, practice your own groundwater stewardship and come to events like this and go to public meetings for those who are managing the groundwater and just share whatever your concerns are. And so that was the whole thing in a very fast amount of time. I think I have some minutes left over. But that's all I got, and I would be happy to answer questions once we get to that point.
Can we share your slides?
Of course, yes.
Okay. So we'll share the slides. The library will put them on their website, and the League and Comal Conservation. And this whole program is also being recorded and will be live on the League's YouTube channel in about a week. And the library will send out a link to it.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalie. Mr. Hall.
Thank you.
Nikki.
Yes.
Thank you. First of all, I want to specifically thank Roxana. You'll see in my presentation, Natalie mentioned about 100 groundwater districts. We're actually number 99 or so. We're one of the newest in the state of Texas. And we started about 27 years ago trying to get a groundwater district. And Roxana has been by our side, helping us from the beginning. So thanks to her specifically and to the League of Women Voters and for having us tonight. Much appreciated. Also want to introduce, we've got a couple of our board members here. Larry Jackson, I thought I saw back in the back of the room. John Harris, our newest board members up here in front. Thank y'all for coming. And then Carl Hawk is our general manager. So during the Q&A, he's going to be available to answer questions that are more of a technical nature. Anyway, the Groundwater District, this is our website, this is our phone numbers. We are appointed officials, we're appointed by the court, but we're available to each of you. For example, Ron Harris represents Precinct 4, Larry Jackson represents Precinct 3 in Comal County, so feel free to talk to them after. We're always available to answer questions. I know that our time's going to be limited here this evening about the amount of questions, but don't hesitate to call us. Our website there, our email address is there. If you go to the website, my phone number is there, and I'm always willing to take questions from the citizens. Natalie showed this slide. I just wanted to emphasize about groundwater districts in Texas, and it's the preferred method, but we're, let's say either 98 or 99, something like that. We're in the scope of the groundwater district in Texas, we're relatively new. We were primarily formed to gather scientific data, which we've been doing since we didn't typically in the state, when you form an organization, a state organization, they don't give you any money, so we had to get some funding before we could start having any scientific gathering. I'm not going to get into Roland's presentation, but I just wanted to point out that Natalie talked about we're over 2 aquifers, and this slide where she mentioned the Balcones, actually we're over the Trinity aquifer here. This is the Edwards contributing zone, but with the Trinity aquifer, at least the underground portion goes from here to the Balcones fault line, which is essentially Landa Park in that area, and all the way across the county. And the Trinity goes underneath there. It's the biggest fault in Comal County, the Balcones fault. The Trinity goes underneath the Edwards at that point. So if you're in New Braunfels, you're standing over the Edwards aquifer, and then underneath that's the Trinity aquifer. The The Trinity Aquifer is a limestone solid, virtually a solid formation. It's got some karst formations in it, some caves and all, but essentially we're a really thick, solid sponge, whereas the Edwards Aquifer is referred to as an underground lake. I don't know that it's that, but for simplicity terms, that's what it is. One of the things that I'm going to go into a little bit of detail and explain to you what we've been doing since we were formed. Each of these red X's on here represents a monitor that we have in a water well in Comal County. And so I'm going to give you some examples of those, but just to give you an idea, they're spread across the county. It's about, we have over 20, I guess there's 23 of them now spread across the county. We're getting ready to add one, Carl tells me, in the upper portion of the county, north of Canyon Lake. But that'll be our number 24th one. And what I want to point out in the presentation is how different they react. And one of the things that we're concerned about, and obviously I mentioned that, I hate to admit it, I've been here 77 years, and I actually was a kid when I came here. So, but what I've seen and observed, some of the data matches. We don't necessarily use observations unless we have some scientific data, but the drought of the 50s, I was here, and of course my place is on the Guadalupe River. It was dry. A lot of people are comparing this drought to the drought of the 50s, and I'd say there are some similarities. I think the biggest difference is that the upper Trinity pretty well, and you'll see this in the last slide, the upper Trinity pretty well supplied springs and water to the Guadalupe River. It's pretty well depleted. It was a small portion of the Edwards Aquifer. Most of it's referred to as the Glen Rose area of the upper Trinity. Just to give you an idea, this is well number one. Well number one is pretty close to the Guadalupe River and 281, 311 area there. This is from October through the current. I want to point out in this particular slide, and note that the graphs indicate, just a few feet. So it's gone from 208 feet down to 211 feet as far as water level below the surface. But what I want to point out on this particular slide is the effect of the rain event that we had, all of us familiar with, in July. You can see it had a fairly immediate effect, probably of 2 weeks, maybe a week in this particular well. Now it's leveled off. This is a group of wells that we've selected in the Bulverde area, and you can see that the well number 13, you can see it also had a pretty immediate effect of the July rains. The other two, not so much. This is some monitoring wells in the Spring Branch area. This particular well number 3, as an example, it maintains a consistent water level, rain or shine. It just doesn't change at all. And the same way with well number 20. So regardless of a rain event, obviously these are recent, so if you get a rain event where the ground gets saturated, we may see, but right now the ground's dry, we get a rain event, not a lot reaches the water-bearing strata of the Trinity. This is some of the Canyon Lake area. Again, you can see over at least the last period of time, and I think if you go back a little further, if you go back when we started these monitors in 2017 for the most part, you'll see that the water level in these particular monitor wells has been pretty flat. I think you're too fat for this thing. This is, we have the United States Geological Survey has a monitoring system at the Guadalupe River at FM 311. This is the last and only monitoring system before Canyon Lake. You can see the activity from October, particularly as we get into the July time frame, how the river went up from up to 30,000 cubic feet per second. I mean, it was roaring. Today it measures about 78 CFS at the measuring gauge at 311. We did a measurement this week at Rebecca Creek. It cuts in about half, so it was measuring around 35 cubic feet per second, to give you an idea of the difference between that and what we're measuring at 311. I'm going to close with kind of some of the things that Natalie mentioned. One of our charges is the protection of the groundwater district, or the groundwater. So our rules that we have, that Carl is responsible for, is that each water well application that we get, we make a field visit to make sure of separation requirements from other wells and from septics. And then during the construction process, we're required to have cement from the surface 100 feet down and from the water-bearing strata 100 feet up. If it's greater than 200 feet, we require bentonite. So we actually, since the groundwater district, we require a complete seal of the water well to prevent contaminants, and also to prevent inter-exchange between the aquifer levels within the Trinity, which there's different levels of the Trinity, as well as when you get into the Edwards Aquifer, we have to have a drill-through permit. We actually seal that area through the Edwards into the Trinity. So it eliminates, or virtually eliminates, any risk of contamination. Natalie mentioned the 5-year planning cycle. We're in that right now, where the report is due, I guess, next year. And it's a detailed report. It's based on science. There is some modeling involved. We use the monitoring system to measure how well we achieve those goals, and we present those at each of our meetings. But with that, I'm going to close and leave the remainder of my time for Q&A. So thank you very much.
Okay, that's well, thank you all for having me here and for the invitation to share about what the Edwards Aquifer Authority does, who we are, what we do, and why we do it. Before I get started, I want to acknowledge one of our board members, Matthew Hoyt, who's seated towards the back. Matthew represents us in Comal County and portions of Guadalupe County, and then you mentioned Larry Jackson. Larry's on our staff, so he's covering a lot of territory tonight. So I'm glad that they're here with us tonight. I wanted to start with just giving some context, historical context, to what the EAA is and why we are the way we are, why we're structured the way we are, why we are not like another groundwater district. As Natalie mentioned, Chapter 36 of the Water Code, where almost every other groundwater district in the state of Texas draws its powers from that chapter of state law. The Edwards Aquifer Authority has its own statutory language dedicated to how the EAA is supposed to do its job. And the reason for that is because we're highly unique in how the state created us and for what purpose it created us. We were born out of a lot of conflict, I would say chaos, and a lot of fear about what might happen to this aquifer if it was not successfully managed over time. And a lot of the issue here is that this aquifer spreads over a large area of south central Texas, as was mentioned earlier, 180 miles from what we call the San Antonio segment of the Edwards Aquifer, from Uvalde County to the west, all the way east to Hays County, and all points in between. So it's a vast aquifer that we're responsible for. And because of that, historically, this aquifer has always been very productive. You go back in time, and just like here in New Braunfels, what drew people here was what? Water availability. Whether it was the springs, the rivers, or the aquifers, and there's an interconnection there. The same applied as you moved further west in the region. And the Edwards Aquifer was always a sustaining lifeblood in terms of water to San Antonio, to the irrigation industry to the west, and certainly here to the interests of Comal County and Hays County. And over time, as we saw population growth come to the region, much like we're seeing today, there was growing concerns if there would be enough water in this aquifer to sustain that growth. And what would happen if, forbid, that this aquifer would go dry. More specifically, if the two major spring systems, the Comal Springs and the San Marcos Springs, if they were to go dry over an extended period of time, what that meant to surface water that would emanate from those two springs. And so there was a lot of wrangling over the years over what was the best solution, and all eyes were intent and focused on the city of San Antonio because it was the largest urbanized metropolitan area within the region that needed the greatest amount of water proportionally across the region. And there were several things that were tried, solutions that were floated out to the citizenry of San Antonio as alternatives, and none of them really resonated and got approved. And then ultimately there was a lawsuit, and the Department of the Interior was sued because there were threatened and protected species under the Endangered Species Act that existed within those two spring systems. And downstream interests and environmental interests got together and said, here's an opportunity to kind of force the city of San Antonio's hand to do something and manage this resource responsibly. And so that lawsuit played out, and in the end, the plaintiffs, they won. And a federal judge out of West Texas, Judge Lucius Bunton, issued his order, and he ordered that the entities get together and come up with a solution, and he gave a date-specific deadline in the future as to when that should happen, and then he kind of put the caveat to it that if one couldn't be achieved, that he had one that he could implement. And so that got local politicians and elected officials moving, and in 1993, the state legislature passed the Edwards Aquifer Authority Act, and it created the powers by which we operate. It was challenged, as you might imagine, in the courts on a number of different fronts. Eventually, it was all resolved, and in 1995, the statute, the EA Act, was modified and ultimately repassed. And in 1996, what formerly was the Edwards Underground Water District, similar to any other Chapter 36 district, was replaced by the EAA. And so the difference is that we operate, I like to say, more akin to a river authority in the sense that we don't abide by county political subdivision lines, but our jurisdictional footprint is much larger, and it attempts to follow the geology, the hydrogeology of the aquifer itself within our area. Now, what further distinguishes the EAA and the way that we operate is the fact that we do have very specific regulatory powers that other groundwater districts don't have. And what I mean by that, it boils down to the ability to say no to people that you cannot get a permit, because what the legislature did was they put in place a cap on how much water could be permitted out of this aquifer on an annualized basis. And they also put boundaries as to where that water could be used. It could only be used within the identified jurisdictional boundaries of where we are and operate. So it created a cap and a defined area where the water could be used. So as a result of that, it was quite an about face from the way that groundwater had been treated prior to that across the state of Texas. I'm going to use a term that you may have heard or maybe not, but generally since the early 1900s, Texas has operated under a legal doctrine known as the rule of capture for groundwater. Now, what that means is that in the state of Texas, you can withdraw and put to use, beneficial use, any water you can get to the surface from your property if you own the property, and that's your right. And you're protected from harming your neighbor, so to speak, so long as you're putting that water to beneficial use, you're not wasting it. And that's been the doctrine that's been prevalent throughout the state since then. So the EA Act comes along, and I wouldn't say that it does away with the rule of capture, but it adds definition to what the rule of capture is within the Edwards region. So we issued permits up to a cap, and those permits ultimately result in one of our permit holders, when they have that permit, it is, by all intents and purposes, a property right. So that permit is yours in perpetuity unless you sell it, lease it, give it away. just like you would another piece of real estate property. And so that's the scenario we work under. And what it enables us to do is carry out our mission. And we kind of narrow down our mission to 3 words. I think they were said earlier. We manage the system, we try to enhance the system the best we can, and we do our best to protect the system within the legal capabilities and authority that we have. I say that because there are a lot of folks who wish we could do more. And oftentimes the answer is, we'd like to do more, but we don't have the legal authority to do more than what we're already doing. So I think the success story is that there is a greater conservation ethic within the Edwards itself than ever existed before. Because what happened with this regulatory regime that was put in place that the state very prescriptively told us to do, that water from the Edwards is now monetized in a very real and meaningful way. So I will tell you that water in the Edwards, when someone wants to sell their permit to someone else, they're someone's real property. So all that to say that it's become a cap and trade system, and you can be familiar with that sort of approach. And what we've learned from that is that short of just pure regulation, when you can match regulation with some sort of economic market-based incentive type of program, in this state, you're more likely to have success over the long term because you're incentivizing the behavior that you want to see. And economics drives it. And so what we're seeing now is there's growing demand for water in our region, in Comal County and in every county within our region. The fact that the Edwards Aquifer is, I would say, is the most regulated aquifer in Texas, but perhaps one of the most regulated aquifers in the United States. Out of all that chaos and conflict, that's what it gave, economic certainty. So when people come into the region, yes, the fact that the Edwards is basically tapped out in terms of there's no new permits to be had unless you go on the market and you acquire a permit from one of your neighbors who has water to sell. That is still appealing to someone coming in, an industry coming in, because there's a tremendous amount of certainty in that water, because it's, like I say, it's like a property right that they know they're going to have. And so the challenge across the rest of the state, as we're talking here tonight, is that people will often ask, and legislators have kind of looked at it, can we regulate groundwater the way that they do in the Edwards elsewhere in the state? And, the question is, I don't know. You can try, but the circumstances in the Edwards were so unique in that you had a nexus of local issues to federal law, the Endangered Species Act, that had forced people, players, interests on opposite sides of this issue to the table to come up with a solution. And absent that, I'm not sure how you get there. And even with all that, we went through the first 2 decades of our existence. We started operating in 1996. I think we resolved our final takings lawsuit in 2015. So anytime you make a change so significant in law that affects people's property, you're going to be challenged. And so there's that to contend with. So it takes a tremendous amount of political will, and that political will often comes out of crisis. So I think you see some of that at play even now. We're in the throes of this drought, depending on when you want to say that it started, 3 to 4 years now in drought. You see a lot of activity at the state capitol around potential solutions. And even this summer, there was, in a special session, we had the chair of the House Natural Resources Committee introducing concepts, at least for discussion, that started to kind of get at the idea that, hey, can we do something different? For example, in East Texas, where they have lots of water, they have water in East Texas where it rains all the time. no water in West Texas where it rarely rains. And so the idea is, can we move water from where it is to where it isn't? And the challenge there is always going to be local politics. And so water management, resource management knows no partisan identity, but the politics around it locally is where the battle often is played out. So I kind of rambled a little bit in all that because I wanted to connect the history to where we are at present and how important that is. We are working very hard now on what we call the next generation of our mission. And it was alluded to, I think, it was alluded to previously about the idea of conservation easements. One of the areas where we do not have regulatory authorities is in the catchment area to the aquifer, up in the contributing zone and recharge. And we have very limited regulatory powers there. But if we borrow from the idea that I said earlier about market-based incentives, the opportunity, I think, is to engage with others and collaborate on potentially purchasing and acquiring as many conservation easements in the Texas Hill Country that would help at least mitigate some of the negative impacts that we potentially see from fast-coming development. We're not anti-development, that's not what I'm saying, but if we can incentivize the kind of growth that would be beneficial to our natural resources, I think that's an area where we can come together and work as citizens, as agencies, as private, public, nonprofit sectors all together. I'll close with that, and the rest of the time will be for Q&A. But thank you. Sure. A conservation easement is simply a negotiated agreement between landowner and some purchasing entity, whether it be a political subdivision or a nonprofit agency like the Nature Conservancy, for example. They negotiate on the sale of the development rights to a piece of property. So you're not outright buying the property, but you're just buying the right to development, and that then exists in perpetuity under the law, and it guarantees that that property will not change in nature, in its state, and it remains in the current state. And what we're seeing is that more and more families, because of their own personal legacy, are open to doing just that, because they'd rather see their property that they have affinity for and sentimental value with stay in its current state and not see it develop. And so I think there's a potential matching of that interest with what we see in terms of the need for protecting natural resources.
My league helpers over here are going through the questions to be sure that we don't have duplicates and to try to have questions for each of our presenters. And I really appreciate the time that you didn't take, because we have plenty of time for questions. And so we will end about 7:45 so that everyone can get out and the library can close at 8 o'clock. So first, Natalie, is the rule of capture ever going to change to take into account the impact on surrounding areas?
That's a really good question. I think that's exactly what will be a huge topic of conversation in the upcoming interim legislative session, in the next regular legislative session. We'll see if it continues beyond that. But I recently heard a lot of attorneys talking about this particular issue, and there are varied opinions, because the rule of capture is a liability law, a rule of torts, and it's not actually a property ownership concept. These are things that I'm venturing out a little further than my field. But there are some opinions that, yes, it could and should change, but then there are some opinions that it will not. So we'll see how that all plays out.
Thank you. Mr. Ruiz, how efficient is pumping water out of one aquifer and pumping it into another aquifer for storage to later draw out and use? Is there a percentage of water loss?
Well, the answer, and I've learned that this is the answer to so many questions when we talk about the Edwards
It depends. So the idea, I think, the question is aimed at aquifer storage and recovery. That's a concept where you take water in a highly transmissive aquifer like the Edwards, where the water moves, and if it's not there, it's not there to capture, and you take that water when it's there and you store it in another aquifer where it's more likely to stay in place, like a sand aquifer. That concept has been proven to work. The San Antonio water system does that, and they've done it successfully now probably for the last 15, maybe 20 years or so. Now, I say it depends because I'll also tell you that New Braunfels Utilities is working on a potential aquifer storage and recovery project that they've been developing for some time now. We kind of try to help them facilitate as a resource what we know about the aquifer. Now, what they're trying to do in concept is take some of their Edwards water and some of their surface water, blend it and store it in the saline portion of the Edwards, where it's, the aquifer is more dense and water doesn't move. Now, at this point, I think they're still through a testing phase, and I don't want to speak out of turn here, but they haven't implemented it yet into their system. They're still working on it. And we're seeing other ASR developments across the region. I think there's some around the Buda area. There's one there. And talk of perhaps Kyle, the city of Kyle, looking into doing something similar.
Out west in Medina County, there's a group that's looking at doing that as well. Conceptually, they're looking at taking some of their Edwards water and storing it in the Trinity, the deep Trinity, which is underlying, which is, again, it's going to be more dense. It's going to be probably in the saline portion of the Trinity. So conceptually, in concept, it works. But does it work in every instance? That remains to be seen. But I think it's a concept that's gaining traction around the state, and it's considered an alternative water supply because in the Edwards, at least, you use your permit in a given year, and you can't carry that permit over, the tally over to the next year. You start over; it comes back to zero. So, for example, what SAWS does is when you're not in drought and they have extra Edwards water, they will still pump it and they'll store it in that other aquifer as basically an underground storage tank. It's a tank they didn't have to build above ground, and it has tremendous capacity. So I think the capacity for that is about, I think they've said 200,000 acre feet that they can store there. And I believe they're looking to expand that here in the near-term future. So as a concept, it would work, but again, it would be dependent on local conditions, local aquifer.
Did you want to add something? No, okay, you were shaking. So
I'm just nodding and agreeing.
Okay, so this question is for Natalie. With the state is encouraging growth. So has the Texas Water Development Board planned for desal plants?
Yes. Well, the regions actually plan for, how we're going to meet our future water supply, but we actually have a really great resource for desalination plants, whether it's groundwater, surface water. There's no marine desalination yet, but we have a database. You can actually see where all of those are, and I'm starting to notice more specifically brackish groundwater plans in the state water plan coming up through the regional water planning groups. And so that's actually something that my part of the agency studies is our brackish groundwater resources, how much there is, where are those hot spots where you could produce without, impacting existing freshwater use or existing brackish users. And also far enough away to avoid kind of the nasty wastewater injection that we put back down to the ground. But we have until 2032 to finish that study. And it's a lot of work to do that for every single aquifer in the state. So there is information out there about where that is, and I hope to see more of that kind of work. Of course, there's a bunch of, you've probably seen news stuff about the Corpus Christi business going on with their desalination plant, but it is something that is included in the state water plan, I would say.
Thank you. Mr. Hull, How is the Comal Trinity Groundwater Conservation District meeting its stated purpose of using the best available science? How much are you able to spend each year on aquifer research?
That's a good question. We're still in the infancy of that, so we have a fairly limited budget. We're not a taxing agency, so our revenue comes from the non-exempt usage. We charge essentially the non-exempt producers a fee. Most of our aquifer science now is devoted to the monitoring system. Site visits. We haven't, at this point in time, hired a consultant. Natalie mentioned the GMA9. We do collectively, as far as the groundwater districts and GMA9, collectively contribute to the gathering of scientific data through GMA9. Through scientific data. I suspect we'll do more of that as we get to be a more mature organization. We're going to have to, I think there's a lot of people in the room that we've talked to about the variety of geology in Comal County as far as the makeup of the Trinity Aquifer, particularly between fault lines, and it's expensive. And Natalie mentioned the study on desired future conditions and the managed available groundwater. When you break that down, excuse me, vertically from the upper to middle to the lower Trinity. Right now we do the Trinity, we study the science, the Trinity as a whole. There's talk that someday we're going to have to study each individual level in more detail. And then horizontally, as you cross, to give you an example, the entire western part of Comal County is designated by the state as a priority groundwater management area because of its lack of water. I mean, the productivity in most of those wells is 5 to 6 gallons per minute, maybe. You can get over into the Garden Ridge area and get more of a, I want to say, an Edwards effect. You're going to get a higher production. You get a higher production in some areas north of Canyon Lake as you get closer to the Edwards. So we've got a lot of scientific work yet to do, I would say. Yeah, why don't you explain that? We do share a well logging trailer in GME9.
What we do specifically on new wells is, as Mr. Hall said, we have a shared logging trailer which runs a gamma log on each well that I choose to pick if it's in an area that we don't know much about. And we actually produce the gamma log on that, which shows us the tops and the bottoms of the Glen Rose, the upper Glen Rose, the middle Glen Rose. It'll tell us where the Cow Creek is. It'll tell us where the Pine Island or the Hammond Shale is. It'll tell us where the water level is. So that done on a new well, in hand with being out there and actually seeing the drill cuttings while it's being drilled, which I do, then getting my hands on the well log, or the well report, and putting all of those together. We don't have that on older wells, but from here on out, we got that good data, and that's real valuable to try to explain what I believe in some areas is just unexplainable, like specifically on the the Monitoring Well 13, how we saw an 80-foot jump in water levels from rains up in Kerrville within a 3-day time period. That I have a hard time explaining. I'm not saying that water up there ended up in that well 3 days later, but I'm saying there was an impact that we have yet to be able to explain. And all this logging and taking water levels, all of that is part of what we do on a daily basis.
And I'd just like to add, in regards to district science funding across the state, there are wildly different, levels of income in all the districts, and that was recognized in this last legislative session. Chairman of the House Natural Resources Committee sponsored a bill to create a groundwater conservation district grant program that would be administered by the Water Development Board. with very specific, reasons to inform science, research, and innovation. That bill did not pass, but we did end up getting the funding for just 2 years. We got $7.5 million, that's a million, not billion, million, in money to distribute to groundwater districts for science, research, and data collection. And we have to spend all that money within just 2 years, unless some folks start to make some efforts to make that a more regular thing. So that is now available, or not now available. We're still planning on getting it out the door, but we need to get it out fast. So that is something that's available to districts in the next 2 years.
Thank you. Mr. Ruiz, how does the EAA prepare for inter-basin transfers? For example, the recently purchased KT wells by the Texas Water Company.
When interbasin transfers are generally, that terminology is largely used for surface water exchanges from basin to basin. In groundwater, you don't necessarily use that terminology. However, we do have some limitation that exists in the movement of Edwards rights. Generally speaking, Edwards rights can be transferred from user to user without any issue, so long as the two parties agree. However, there is one limitation, and that is groundwater that exists west of Cibolo Creek cannot be transferred to east of Cibolo Creek. And that's a rule that's been in place for a long time now. The rationale behind that, when that rule first came into play, was that pumping closest to the two spring systems is likely to have the biggest impact. And so our board of directors thought that it would be a good idea to mitigate that by putting in place that rule. So it's created, it did create some hardship for folks who were needing water east of Cibolo, but they've grown accustomed to it now and found alternative water supplies. But that's the only limitation really to speak of. Beyond that, you cannot export Edwards water outside of our jurisdictional boundaries. So that prohibition also remains in place. So there's a lot of safeguards that are in place by law for the Edwards that help prevent a lot of the concerns that exist elsewhere in the state.
Thank you. Okay, Natalie, they have your name on it, so I have. We've received several questions about why residential developments are still being allowed. Why are old water availability reports being accepted when the current situation is so different and there is no proof that there'll be enough water in the future?
That is a wonderful question that the Texas Water Development Board does not have jurisdiction over. However, in regards to new subdivisions and who are using groundwater as a supply, there are some requirements in the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality Rules requiring, you prove up that you are able to supply that groundwater to the community for 20 or 30 years, I can't remember. And that's actually something that's required now, a mandatory thing for counties and cities. I do think that there are some counties and cities who probably need some guidance on how to approach that because they may not have the expertise, but groundwater conservation districts are a wonderful resource for the counties on those types of things. So I may have not directly answered that question, but that's what I know about it.
If I could add, one of the things that's also happened in the region, at least in the Edwards, with these developments coming in, there are water purveyors, public utilities, that have, by local ordinance, adopted the requirement whereby any new developments that come into their service area, into their certificated area of service, they're requiring those developments to bring with them the water. In other words, in the Edwards, they have to provide the water that they're going to need for their operation to exist. But that's not mandated by law, that's just local ordinance that these utilities are using to help manage the growth to their benefit. So, for example, I know that that's what happens in Medina County with utility users out there, because they're seeing a lot of growth, fast coming growth, data centers and such that are coming in, and they're basically telling them, if you're going to require, well, they're not going to require, they are required to provide water under law if they're in their CCN, but by local ordinance, they can require them to bring that water with them.
Mr. Hull, what would happen if a homeowner with a private exempt residential well started selling their water to someone else?
Could you repeat that, please? Repeat the question, Roxanne.
What would happen if a homeowner with a private exempt residential well started selling their water to someone else?
So it's a great question. I'm not sure I'm sure that exists. I know that we have situations where private well owners do provide water to others. Natalie mentioned the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. So once they become a public water supply well, then if they retail water from an exempt well, the TCQ will step in and reclassify that, and then the rules of exempt wells will kick in.
So should the person who knows this tell TCEQ? Who are they supposed to report this to? I think that's what they want to know.
Like if you're supplying a large volume of water from a residential well, you'll probably need to adjust your well to serve up that, and that would require a district trip.
Yes. Yeah, so when we permit a well, we'll permit it to that category. So if it changes from a residential or a non-exempt well to an exempt or vice versa, then that well permit holder will have to come back to the district and change the permit.
And then they would need to meter it, because if they're going to be selling water, they'd want to measure the volume of water.
And they would need to meter it. Should they be turned into TCQ? I'd have to leave that up to the individual. To be honest with you, on the Comal Trinity Groundwater District, we certainly, if we run into a violation, we'll deal with it. Generally, we're not a police organization. We're a beneficial organization that serves each of y'all. So if the permit holder in our particular case is not following the permit guidelines, yes, we wouldn't have to turn them into the TCQ. We would take care of it ourselves.
Thank you. Mr. Ruiz, what is your position on returning gray water back into the aquifer? Can we regulate to keep the aquifer clean?
Yeah, right now there are rules that prohibit, there are certain standards that are required if you're going to inject into the Edwards, and actually those are TCEQ rules. There are injection standards, for injection wells into the Edwards. So that's not happening now. We do see, like with all this ASR development through the Edwards to underlying aquifers, those protections come into play there, because sometimes it's not just Edwards water that they want to inject. It's other water supplies, maybe treated surface water and such. So we're not averse to that because it's providing a need to the water supply needs of the region. But we would always defer to the standards of the state of TCEQ on what those requirements and limitations would be.
Thank you. We're trying to be fair here and not make any one person talk more than the other. I'm skipping to Larry for the moment.
Still got a turn.
We received several questions from individuals and with their own wells. What can individuals do to conserve water? If a well runs dry or is getting drier, would you recommend drilling deeper wells, hydrofracking, rainwater harvesting? What should a homeowner do?
That's a great question. So I'm going to it gives me a great opportunity to preach a little bit about the use of groundwater. Unfortunately, even during the drought period, although I think we're seeing some better use, beneficial use, it depends on the individual. Some people consider watering their grass a beneficial use. The state in our planning guidelines, when we do our planning, we frankly don't plan on green grass. Would be a fair statement. And while we don't have any exact measurements, when you look at studies around the state, and even when you look at Google Earth and you see green grass, it's still the people's property rights. So they have a well, the right of capture kicks in, but generally speaking, anywhere from 40 to 60% of the groundwater today is being used to water grass. So there's some legislative things that have happened this legislative session to help us help neighborhoods conserve. Heretofore, the HOA could penalize if they had rules, and many of them do, on how much green grass you have to have. Those rules have been superseded by the state, so we're getting some help from the state on what kind of vegetation should go in. And essentially, the way I look at it, particularly since I've lived here so long, and we live in a really sensitive natural area, and so we try to ask people to be respectful and treat the natural area naturally. And so when you bring in vegetation that's not natural, it's going to require more water. So we have approached it from an educational standpoint. I think we've done events like this. I think we've done some good. I think we have to change a little bit of, if you came out to my place, I'm an active farmer and rancher, so I depend on the rain to produce crops. And believe it or not, we had 2 cuttings of hay this year. The rain came at the right time, and it just was just by the grace of God. But we've had years recently that the seeds didn't even germinate, and since I was a kid, we've never had that happen. But I found that at least in the area around my house, and I'm going to tell you a story on myself. I put in a sprinkler system at my house when we built it. I turned it on once, and I watched the little bulb on my water well go up, and it didn't get through the complete cycle for my water storage tank ran out of water. That's the first and only time I've ever used the sprinkler system. So what we've got in our yard is native plants and native grass and native flowers and native bees and native butterflies, and it's a joy. And the deer don't necessarily munch on it, although they found some things to eat. But so I think we'll continue to try to educate people. The natural. I'm getting tongue-tied here. The naturalists in our county have been very helpful about helping us educate residents of Comal County on what works best. And we have to change that if we're going to sustain ourselves, at least in the Trinity Aquifer, and I think the Edwards is the same thing. They offer SAWs and other public entities offer incentives. We're going to have to learn how to better use our groundwater in a natural way, in a human way, rather than maintaining a green yard. People come in, they're used to coming in from a place that has abundant water and having green grass. We don't live in an area like that. We live in a semi-arid region, and we need to learn how to be more cautious in how we use our groundwater.
If anyone ever sees a yard sign that says "Going Blonde" for the summer, please let me know immediately, because I will buy them out. I've been looking for something like that for a long time. Thank you.
Mr. Ruiz, the EAA has done a good job with conservation easements around San Antonio. What are you doing to better protect the Edwards Aquifer in and around Comal County?
There's a little background to that. There's
I could get these numbers wrong, so don't hold me to it. I think there's about 180,000 acres of lands that are under conservation easement in Uvalde, Medina, and Bexar County, and up on the recharge zone and contributing zone to the Edwards. And the reason that that's happened that way is because for the past 25 years or so, the city of San Antonio has funded those conservation easement purchases. For the better part of 20 years, they did that through an 8-cent sales tax, and that's the citizens of Bexar County voted to tax themselves to allocate that money for these, specifically for the purpose of conservation easement acquisition. Now, the reason they targeted those counties to the west and Bexar County is because the way they justified it to the citizenry was that the flow paths of the Edwards flow from west to east, and they sold it as protecting their water supply. So it didn't extend into Comal and into Hays County for that reason. But we've seen that's the void that exists, and so we're looking at ways to do more of that to the eastern part of the region. A couple of years ago, we were successful in leveraging some monies from Microsoft Corporation to acquire a conservation easement here in Comal County. It's an 1,100-acre ranch that the family wanted to preserve, and they're surrounded by development. They didn't want to see that happen, so they were willing partners, and we executed that easement. We've done smaller parcels in partnership with Hays County, for example, around San Marcos, and we're looking to do more where we can. The challenge for us is financial resources, because these can be expensive. They are expensive. It's a property that you're basically buying their development rights. So our effort has been to try to find willing partners in both the private sector and through other philanthropic arms to work with us. And we'd love to play matchmaker, very much the way that we did with Microsoft and the family here in Comal County. And that will take time, but I think that's a viable formula for moving in that direction to get more conservation easements, more land under conservation easement. And ideally, we're also investing quite a bit in having more tools to evaluate properties for their value to conservation easement. Our board of directors just last month approved a contract for a development of a recharge model that will allow us to evaluate by parcel of land the value of a property to recharge to the Edwards over time. Now, that's going to be a multi-year effort. I think it's going to take the better part of 2 to 3 years, and it's going to end up costing us, I think, about $700,000 to do it. So these things don't come cheap, and they take the right resources. The science, I think we talked a little bit about science tonight. I think having the science to prove up these efforts is very important. I think there are opportunities, for example, in the private sector, in the corporate world, with large corporations who are looking at ways to mitigate their impact on the environment, and they're looking for places where they can invest those dollars and have a real effect. So the opportunity's there. I think we just need to kind of collaborate with the right people and get it done.
Thank you very much. Well, Natalie, doom and gloom, what are the backup plans and water sources if groundwater aquifers dry up?
Well, first of all, aquifers will not dry up. It's more a matter of access to that water, because all of our aquifers have a ton of water in them, and folks drill pretty shallow to start with, because that's the easiest and cheapest option. So there's always the option to go deeper, and there's okay. So there's always the opportunity to drill a deeper well, and then of course part of the Texas Water Fund that's funded. It's going to be on the ballot in November. It already exists.
It's to develop new water supply sources. So it's there's a new water supply fund that's focused specifically on aquifer storage and recovery projects. Of course, that's not necessarily new water. I would argue there's not really new water, but and also it would be directed to brackish supply, and so like really investing in ways to get our brackish water supplies into a usable form. But really, I personally think that it's more of a community effort to do everything possible that we can to just all the options, we have to do them, really. Conservation easements, rainwater harvesting, put in those native flowers for all the bees. It's kind of an all of the above approach, in my own opinion.
One thing, I think I didn't get a chance to answer the question about water wells going dry. What Natalie said is probably true. There are, no question, there are 2 or 3 areas in Comal County that you can drill as far down as you want to go. There's no water. But we've identified those areas, we know where they are, but generally speaking, I don't know how many calls we've received during this 3 or 4 year drought period, a lot about people, what can they do because their well's gone dry. In reality, the well hasn't really gone dry. It's that they're either pumping beyond the capacity of the well, and normally they don't have a storage tank. So, and particularly in a pigma where the water wells are low producing and produce 5 to 6 gallons per minute, if you use over 5 to 6 gallons a minute, you're going to run out of water. That's why we have storage tanks. But when you consider if you don't have a storage tank, the only storage you have is the well, the hole. And you know, if the water level goes down to the pump, your pump's going to turn off. And you're going to have to give time for the well cavity itself to recharge. So we just tell people either you have to, adapt, maybe support it with the rainwater catchment system, or you're going to have to put in a storage tank of some sort to supplement and give any kind of overage over the pumping capacity of your particular well and whatever you're in is going to have to be supplemented by a storage tank. Otherwise, it appears that you're running out of water. But certainly, if you have those issues and you think we can, and we don't get into the area of drilling, we're not drillers, we're a science gathering organization, but certainly if you have a question about that, we'll be glad to help you with it. If you think your well is dry, we'd like to know about it. But generally, it has to do with a capacity issue of using more than the well is pumping. I want to say about conservation easement too. Comal County has been very active and we have a number of large conservation easements. We have a number of organizations that purchase those conservation easements. The sponsor here tonight, the Comal County Conservation Alliance, is actively promoting conservation easements. It is expensive, so generally it involves a public-private partnership. We prefer that as a groundwater district in the purchase of a land. I can tell you that it takes constant attention to keep several hundred acres to where it is able to recharge because of all the things that happen with land. Cedar growth, having to remove cedar growth, get it ready to hold a rainfall event so it'll soak into the ground. And so we would prefer to have private-public partnerships and let those organizations help be the stewards of the land rather than buy the land and then have to take that huge capital investment and have to take care of it for the rest of its life. So it's better to do a private-public partnership.
So, Larry, this question is for you. Your monitoring charts that you showed, the levels was over a 2-year spans, but you've been doing this for 8 years, so the audience member is curious about the change pre-drought, the water levels pre-drought compared to now.
We do have, we started in 2017, so we started with 3 or 4 monitors back then. We've just recently got up to the 23 monitors that I referred to. Actually, I'm sure y'all can all appreciate this. Getting a resident to agree to put a monitoring system on their water well wasn't easy. And believe it or not, we just couldn't get people to do it. You know, like, hey, we've identified this area, we'd like to, who are you? Well, we're a government agency. We're a government agency and want to put a moniker on my, I'll get out of here. So what happened though was Vulcan. Vulcan started, and so the Groundwater District, in a lot of cases, whether it's Vulcan or Honey Creek, when we know there's going to be an event in Comal County that may have a negative effect on the aquifer, we'll preempt that. And I'll use the Vulcan quarry as an example. So as soon as the land was purchased for the Vulcan quarry, we went around to all the surrounding neighbors, and we tested, and we did it in cooperation, by the way, with the team of the Edwards Aquifer Authority, which we do, by the way, Roland and his team and our group work very well together on any number of projects. They have a lot more resources, so sometimes I go back. And they've been very cooperative as the state in providing us with resources. But we go, and we've done two things, and I'm just going to use the Vulcan as an example. We do all the water testing. We'll test the water quality. We'll test the water levels. And people were a little bit more, but not so reluctant. So they let us put monitors around that. So we've now got a database that's 3.5 years old of what the water quality was pre-Vulcan, what the levels were pre-Vulcan. And so we have a base now. So when they get into operation, we'll be able to retest those waters to make sure there's no evidence of contamination. So we do have a history. Actually, I had well number one, and we went back to the time it was put in because it was put in first. So there's definitely, and I don't know if we may have it, but it's on. We'll post it on our website. You can definitely see the results of this drought. If you go back 3 years, it's a significant drop, but not. You know, it's recovered because of the rain, not like it was, but you can go back to when I was a kid too. We haven't recovered to those levels since the drought of the 50s. Just not going to happen when you have a recharge rate of 4.5 to 6.5% under the best of conditions. It's going to be real difficult regardless of growth. It's going to be difficult to get back to those original. I'm not saying it's impossible, and I'm saying it's one of our objectives as far as recharge and teaching people how to get their property better recharge. But recharge is like Natalie referred to. You've got a bank account with X number of water in it, and the only way to get more money in it is to put more money in it. The aquifer is the same way. The only way we have to get more water other than artificial means like aquifer storage and recovery is rain. And on a rain event, you're not going to get an entire rain event. At best, you're going to get 3.5 to 6% of a rain event will ever reach the water-bearing strata. That's not very much. So we have some catching up to do. It's going to be real difficult with the growth. We're going to give it the best job we can.
Thank you very much. Mr. Ruiz, if you draw down 30 feet every 50 years, how long will the water last?
I'm not good with math. But for example, in the Edwards, and I can only really speak to the Edwards, you see during droughts like we're having now, significant drawdowns in aquifer level. And what we do when we see those significant drawdowns is we have what we call a critical period management plan. It's a drought plan. And we basically restrict how much of one's permit is available to them for pumping to help mitigate those rapid declines. So we were able to get that program into our statute back in 2007, and so it's in state law. And what that means is that even our local board can't really change that without going back to the legislature. We added a stage 5. We have stages 1 through 4 of cutback, and then we get to stage 5, which is done by local policy. But in total, we have the ability to cut back permitted use by 44% over an annual
year. So that's intended to mitigate the drawdown on the aquifer. But the thing about the Edwards, because it is a karst limestone aquifer, its value lies in the fact that when it does rain, when there is recharge, it replenishes itself quickly. And so it takes a series of rain events to do that, or unfortunately a massive flood event. That's historically what has happened in the Edwards. You've had drought followed by massive amounts of rain that come all at once. We just haven't seen that happen over the past 4 to 5 years, so hence we are where we are. But what we have seen that has happened is that decline in aquifer levels have significantly been mitigated through, I think, some of the regulatory programs and restrictions. And as a result of those restrictions and regulations, I think the region has done a good job in diversifying their water portfolios. For example, there's even here in New Braunfels, as I understand New Braunfels Utilities, they tell me that within their water portfolio, the Edwards makes up about 18% of their total water inventory, which is significantly less than it once was. I think you're seeing the same across the region. Major water purveyors recognize that the Edwards is a solid source of water for them, but they have to diversify and build on that and add other sources because there's only so much there to be had. And with the growth that we're seeing, exacerbated by drought, you have to have at least a bank of water available to use during those times, because you can't not provide water to people for their health and well-being.
Thank you. Natalie, are there any groundwater conservation districts that across the state considering ways to provide incentives to landowners to engage in land use practices aimed at enhancing the recharge in their catchments?
There are, let's see if this works now. If I get real close, it does. There are, and actually that is one of the required goals that groundwater districts have to include in their groundwater management plans, is how they're going to, deal with breast control, enhance recharge. There's a whole slew of required management goals that districts are required to include. And so I don't know the details of absolutely every single district off the top of my head, but I'm sure that they are out there.
Thank you. Well, I think that ends our question and answer period. I want to please get them Thank you all for being in the room today. I'm sorry it was warm. Come back another time, and come back in several years when the Ty Preston Memorial Library will have built a whole new edition of new meeting room space. So thank you very much for coming.